everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Cognition Ignition. So today I just wanted to share with you a topic that I actually found a good article this morning. Well, it's more of an encyclopedia page, and the concept is going to be compatibilism. And what this means is there's a debate whether free will is compatible with determinism. And I think if you're somebody who is trying to develop yourself, then this is a pretty good concept to understand. But another reason that I wanted to go into this is because I do find that typology is very deterministic, but it shouldn't be. I do think that there is a lot of room for improvement where a person's individual growth is not very deterministic, and that if we become aware of ourselves, we have more potential to use our own free will. I think it's something that does emerge through the process of deterministic processes, and it could take time to really gain a sense of free will. So what I wanted to do was go through some of the arguments for and against compatibilism, and then I just want to give my take on how I've understood free will through my own development. So I have this article here, and I'm just going to read through the concept. I'm going to just kind of go over it. So compatibilism is to the free will problem. This concerns a disputed incompatibility between free will and determinism. Compatibilism is the thesis that free will is compatible with determinism. Because free will is typically taken to be a necessary condition of moral responsibility, compatibilism is sometimes expressed as a thesis about the compatibility between moral responsibility and determinism. So now, causal determinism, we're going to learn about what that is. Compatibilism emerges as a response to a problem posed by causal determinism. But what problem is that? Well, suppose as a thesis of causal determinism tells us that everything occurs is an inevitable result of the laws of nature in the state of the world in the distant past. If this is the case, then everything human agents do flows from the laws of nature in the way the world was in the distant past. So basically, determinism says, if this happens, then this will happen. And then you can add, if this and this happen, then this will happen. So it's just a bunch of if-then statements, basically, that are within us based on our genetics, based on the environment that we were raised in, based on our ancestors, which actually anybody who's ever taken any time to really understand physics, this makes actually a lot of sense that the pieces all come together. If the pieces of the past didn't fit, the pieces of the future will come together a different way. So this actually does make a lot of sense. So if what we do is simply the consequence of the laws of nature in the state of the world in the distant past, then we cannot do anything other than what we ultimately do, nor are we in any meaningful sense the ultimate causal source of our actions, since they have their causal origins in the laws of nature in the state of the world long ago. Okay, so the only thing I would really say about this is that we would have to really understand what set those laws into nature before those laws of nature into action, before we could really say that the actions of the past are in total control of what we do now, because what we don't understand is what set the actions of nature into movement. So one thing I think about is like when we think about the Big Bang, we don't really understand what set that into action. So when I think about free will, I'm also thinking about consciousness. And one thing is, we don't know if there was something conscious and aware before that allowed the physical processes to begin taking place. I'm not speculating that there definitely was, but there is nothing saying that there wasn't. But we can't just say, I've always said, you can't say things started moving without some type of catalyst. To me, the most obvious catalyst would be consciousness and awareness of consciousness. So we'll get more into that. Determinism seems to prevent human agents from having the freedom to do otherwise, and it also seems to prevent them from being the source of their actions. If either of these is true, then it's doubtful that human agents are free or responsible for their actions in any meaningful sense. Now, one thing that I would bring up here is that if we are not responsible for our actions, then why would some people find it? Why do we feel guilty for those actions? And that's an internal thing. And what I kind of wanted to point out here is that for every action, there's going to be an equal and opposite reaction. This includes psychologically, and that you're not necessarily going to observe these actions. So what I think these actions actually do is allow us to have feedback, and these get stored into the back of our brain. This is something quite common. This is why when introverts take time to respond, they're actually neurons going to the back of the brain to pick up the pieces that they understand. And when they act on those pieces, it is more from an internal viewpoint. So what I think happens is our intuition forms calcifies some of our beliefs and gives us the feedback, which allows us to act out of the deterministic states that we're in. Because the fact is, people do feel responsible for their actions, and they do find meaning in things. Now, the thing that I'm thinking is that this is something non-physical. This is a psychological agent, basically. This is agency for psychological processes, which aren't necessarily going to be tracked in the moment, because these things happen in our sleep. These things happen over time. And often these things happen with intent. These things need intent. So the free will of intent. So we'll keep reading through this. Among many others, present a real problem for those who are inclined to think that we are free and responsible for our choices and actions, and the natural world might operate as a deterministic system, or if not completely deterministic, one in which an indeterminism is merely stochastic noise that is causally irrelevant at the level of human agency. How to respond to such argument? On the one hand, incompatibilists accept some version of at least one of these arguments, and so insist that our self-conception as free and responsible agents would be seriously misguided if causal determinism turns out to be true. Some incompatibilists argue for these conclusions indirectly, first by arguing that determinism precludes freedom or control of the second, by arguing that such freedom is necessary for moral responsibility. Other incompatibilists argue directly that causal determination precludes moral responsibility. And that actually is something I do believe that does happen. But what I do think is that we don't understand what happens before. I do think we're basically born into a state of determinism. We don't really have agency as children. And it's not until we gain the sensory data and things like that that we actually begin to use our intuition to form conclusions, which allow us to gain a sense of self, a realization, an awareness of how we prefer to be, want to act, which is then turned into the ability to use free will. I also believe that free will is generally suppressed through things that indoctrinate us, where because free will is not always morally, what you choose to do with your free will is not always morally acceptable. So it does seem that that by understanding what determinism really is, we can actually control and suppress free will within others. So what compatibilists, on the other hand, claim that these concerns miss the mark. Some compatibilists hold this because they think the truth of causal determination would not undermine our freedom to do otherwise. So this is similar to the idea of free will. So like the ideas are still going to come up. through natural processing using our cognition and cognitive functions. But the ability to not act on those things is an indicator that we do have free will. This is something Sam Harris talks about a lot, and he's often argued about it. A lot of people argue him on this. As a result, these compatibilists tell us the truth of causal determinism poses no threat to our status as morally responsible agents. The freedom to do otherwise is sufficient for the kind of control an agent must possess to be morally responsible for his or her actions. Now, what I would say is if somebody doesn't have the ability to become aware that they have moral responsibility and what their actions will do, then they are living more in a deterministic state, which is, we can really relate just to instincts. They are acting off of instincts, which we know at a young age, babies and children do. And beforehand, we don't really know what is going on necessarily, but those leading up to life, what goes on. That's kind of what I'm getting at there. Let's keep reading. Other compatibilists show less concern in rebutting the conclusion that freedom to do otherwise is incompatible with determinism. Compatibilists of this stripe reject the idea that such freedom is necessary for meaningful forms of free will. The varieties of free will worth wanting, and even more notably, some compatibilists simply deny that freedom of this sort in any way connected to morally responsible agency. What we see here is not a unified front in the face of the incompatibilist challenges. Instead, compatibilists have been careful to identify the precise elements of incompatibilist arguments that they take to be erroneous, and then build their respective theories of freedom and responsibility with that in mind. So here's the thing. You can't disprove determinism. It happens. Pretty much any time you decide to make a decision, that is a long-term decision. You are determining that there will be a specific outcome based on the actions you choose to take. So for myself, this is something like when I chose to do jujitsu. It was, I understand that there are steps that I will take to end up a blue belt, that I will end up winning competitions. And these are all deterministic. Now, in my opinion, what happens is that through this, eventually I'm going to come to some other decision as I begin gaining sensory data points in this specific area where there are precise rules and guidelines contained within the environment that I'm engaging with. And through this, what happens is these data points get stored in the back of my own brain, the same way it does with anybody else, and it becomes part of my conceptualization of how the world works. And at some point, you begin having all the pieces you need in order to actually change your worldview, if this is possible, if you have the freedom to do this based on the pressure applied from the outside sources, which you really don't have control over, but that if you are in an environment that allows for you to begin conceptualizing what these really mean, you can begin making decisions on your own free will. If you don't do this, then yeah, you are stuck in a state of determinism. And I do think these are states. And I think that determinism is a state that lasts longer than free will. Free will is basically a micro state, which you get access to when intuition begins really taking over. So when you make the decision to do something new, you are setting yourself up for a process of determinism, which you will begin learning how to do, how to interact within a specific environment. And yes, the causal determinism will happen. It's the same thing as if you want to start working out. If you want to get smarter, you can say, what would cause you to get smarter? This is determined already. But the free will comes from the want to actually become smarter, the awareness that you can become smarter, rather than just going about your life, basically how what Andrew Tate talks about it. You're stuck in the matrix if you don't get to this point of free will, acting how you would rather act. And that's where we're at right now. To help better situate compatibilist theories, we will now consider in more detail the arguments that incompatibilists have advanced on behalf of their own theories. Since it is these arguments that have shaped the contours of compatibilist theories, as we mentioned above, the truth of causal determinism apparently poses a problem for freedom and responsibility in at least two ways. First, it might entail that no one has the freedom to do otherwise, which is a kind of power or control over one's action that many have regarded as necessary for moral responsibility, obviously. Second, it might entail that no one is the ultimate causal source of his or her actions, that our actions originate in our free will and not in forces outside of us, also seem like a plausible condition on morally responsible agency. We take each of these potential threats in turn. So what I read here is that basically they're taking away the entire inner world from somebody. And I'll be honest, Elodie, I'm still learning these concepts. I'm trying to figure it out for myself. I'm just answering your question for who's interested. Well, not a question, but a comment. So, yeah, I'm still trying to figure out all the arguments. I do realize that you can't argue against determinism. That's the number one thing that you have to realize is you can't argue against it. You have to figure out where free will fits into that. And I do think that through advancing through some type of phase, which is also why I think I like to look at things in stages, because through advancing through those deterministic stages, going to school, you'll get educated. Advancing through those allows for more use of free will, because you actually have the pieces to begin putting together to understand what your will is. I don't think as a child you don't understand what your will is. I think a child, you understand what's possible. You can envision those things, but you can't actually impose your will on anything. And also what I see here is an argument against introversion in a way, that there is no real inner world other than that, because we would still be considered a process in the outer world where our hormones and neurotransmitters are just a process of the outer world that are moving around. But I would say that because we can visualize things, we can dream, we can create ideas, I think we have more agency than what these arguments represent. So determinism and alternative possibilities, which what I'm reading is that I do think determinism allows us to narrow in on the probabilities, where free will is more about the possibilities. It's the ability to choose the possibility, or to become aware of the possibilities and begin moving towards possibilities. As you move towards possibilities, determinism sets in. Now, when determinism sets in, you are more likely to become aware of probability than possibility. But the probability is still not guaranteed. They've actually given a lot of examples into this in the arguments against incompatibility. So we'll get into those. But a natural way to think of an agent's control over her conduct at a moment. But my thing is that it's not always in a moment. Free will is not momentary. Free will is more set in as a concept, as a guideline, which allows you to engage into something that will allow you to form based off of the outer rules. That's why I used jiu-jitsu, because the ability to engage with that was not incremental. It was an overarching decision, and every day I have to make the decision to put myself into a deterministic, into the actions that will allow determinism to play out. So that means showing up every day and things like that. And I can also have free will in deciding not to show up. When I decide not to show up, it's more of my free will, because I've already created the networks that allow me to show up. I am living my life to those networks, which is deterministic. This is when I talk about a foundation. your foundation is the determinism that you have put into action that you will use consistently later on. I hope I'm explaining this right, but it's coming out right, I think. So a natural way to think of an agent's control over her conduct at a moment in time is in the terms of her ability to select among or choose between alternative courses of action. This picture of control stems from common features of our perspectives as practical deliberators settling on courses of action. Okay? If a person is choosing between voting for Clinton as opposed to Trump, it is plausible to assume that her freedom with regard to her voting consists at least partially in her ability to choose between these two alternatives. On this account, acting with free will requires alternative possibilities, yes. A natural way to model this account of free will is in terms of an agent's future as a garden or forking paths, branching off from a single past, which I think your single past gets stored into the back of your brain. Basically, all the sensory data that you collect, it gets stored, and when you have enough of that, intuition can begin working. On this account, acting with free will requires alternative possibilities. A natural way to model this account of free will is in terms of an agent's future as a garden or forking paths branching off from a single past. A locus of freely willed actions arises when the present offers, from an agent's singular past, more than one path into the future. On this model of human agency, then, when a person acts of her own free will, she could have acted otherwise. So what they're basically saying is because there's choice, and you can only choose one, it must have been done on free will. There are arguments against this as well. This has actually been something that's been argued for a long time, at least 60 years, where you can find a lot of reading on it, but there is more. This conception of free will immediately invites the thought that determinism might be a threat. For determinism, understood in the strict sense characterized above, tells us that at any time, given the facts of the past and laws of nature, only one future is possible. But according to the conception of human agency under consideration, a freely willing agent could have acted other than she did, and hence that more than one future is possible. So here's the example. This is the equation. Argument that codifies the considerations. Agent X performs act A of X's own free will if X has control over A. X has control over A only if X has the ability to select among alternative courses of action to act. If X has the ability to select among alternative courses of action to act A, then there are alternative courses of action to act A, open to X. X could have done otherwise. If determinism is true, then only one future is possible, holding fixed the actual past and the laws of nature. If only one future is possible, holding fixed the actual past and the laws of nature, then there are no alternative courses of action to any act open to X. So X could not have done otherwise than she actually does. Now, this is really intangible because once you're past the moment, you can't have proof that they could not have acted any other way. So that's one thing I would say is, like, once you go into their past decision, what could have, should have, would have happened but didn't happen, it's intangible. So there's no proof here. It's an equation of common sense. You can deduct that from anything, but you don't have any proof of the actual time. You don't even understand what points were collected previously in order for the decision to be made. And I think that, you could, like I said, you can deduct to this reasoning, but it's not even like really scientific. It's just a deduction. Therefore, if determinism is true, it is not the case that any agent X performs act A of her own free will. But if you're just going to say once it happened, it was determined, that's not actually taking into consideration the intangible, what you can't really see. So the intangible factors that are actually coming up. So they made this actually easy with a 3-step of what's actually happening. They simplify it. If someone acts of her own free will, then she could have done otherwise. If determinism is true, no one can do otherwise than one actually does. Therefore, if determinism is true, of her own free will. So what you're seeing here is they are like somebody is trying to say that it's incompatible. I like to see. We're going to go down and see the compatibility arguments. So this incompatible argument, according to the argument, if determinism is true, no one has access to alternatives of the sort you might plausibly think to be required for free will. So determinism and sourcehood, this conception of the sort of control that might be necessary for morally responsible agency. The only thing the one reason I don't like determinism, like the way that it makes sense is that you can't hold anybody responsible, but that is not true. And I think that you have a lot of people who haven't actually interacted with people coming up with these theories because these are just common sense. Like if you didn't engage in life, you would be like, oh yeah, it's deterministic. It's the problem with science. You have people who haven't actually had a lot of experience with this. But if you've actually worked with people, you understand that, yeah, determinism happens. And through time, what emerges through determinism is the ability to choose because you are aware. And when you become aware of something, you have a moral responsibility for your actions. So this conception starts with the observation that an agent's control seems to consist in her playing a crucial role in the production of her actions. Think in terms of transparent difference between those events and the products of one agency and those that are merely bodily habits. For instance, consider the choice to pick up a cup of coffee as opposed to the event of one's heart beating or one's blood circulating. So those are all deterministic actions, I think. Not the cup of coffee, but the heart beating and circulating. Those are all deterministic. Now, did we have a choice to have life? We don't know. It depends on how related we are to our parents. I think that the connection of the sperm and the egg, like how much of our parents' past is ingrained into those. Heart beating or one's blood circulating. In the later case, one recognizes events happening to one. In the former, so you're recognizing within one sense what's happening. In the former, one is the source and producer of that happening. So we are the source of our heart beating, and our blood circulating. On this model of human agency, control is understood in terms of being the source of one's action. So basically, us being alive and breathing is a deterministic process, and because of that, we can pick up a cup. But what else happens besides picking up a cup? What else happens? That's like the question. Are there more intangible things that besides picking up a cup that are actually happening with us, which allow us to have more choice? So, fixing just upon this conception of agency, how might determinism pose a threat to free will? If determinism is true, then what happened in the distant past when combined with the laws of nature is causally sufficient for the production of every human action. But if this is so, then while it might be true that an agent herself is crucially involved in the production of her action, that action actually has its source in causal antecedent that originate outside of her. Hence, she as an agent is not the ultimate source of her actions. See, because once you understand that, all of these past are actually written in some way, codified into your brain, and you have access to become aware of them. Granted, some of us do not become aware of these things. How does that leave you out of the equation? How did your internal subjective free will out of the equation of your actions? So what is meant here by the ultimate source and not just a source? An agent is an ultimate source of her action only if, at the very least, something necessary for her action originates within the agent herself. And that's what I believe does happen. I believe, like, when we become aware of something, it is something originating within our own selves. That's why we have our own explanations of how things happen, our own worldviews of how things happen, that these are originated within us. And it didn't, and what I like, and what I would say here is that it doesn't need to have been like something that was with us from birth. It's something that emerges over time. It's an ability, actually, the ability to have free will. The same way, like the physical properties, like we have these abilities and we can choose not to or to do them. But let me keep going. It can prior to the agent is freely willing her action. But why? That doesn't make sense. It should be, because if you understand the process of intuition, the process of gathering information, the process of creating concepts and contextualizing things in the back and forth, this is like also kind of what meditation helps people with. Like it doesn't happen in the instance. You can actually begin you set determinism. So. And if you are the ultimate source of your own consciousness and your actions, you can, and then you realize that you can set those actions, or you can determine beforehand how you would want to be, and then you set determinism into action. But these would all be on your own free will. Like when you set your own rules of ethics or guidelines of how you choose to act, and you actually do act on those, that's because you had the free will to determine that at one point, and then you set those into motion by taking the actions that allow you to do that. It's like, for me, if I want to win a jiu-jitsu tournament, I can set that in, I can ingrain that into myself, but I can make that decision months before and start training for that. So it doesn't make sense that it cannot be located in time to the agents freely willing her action. Conditions guaranteeing them, how can she be said to control them? The conditions sufficient for their occurrences were already in place long before she even existed. This is tough, because I do believe that at one time, because we're in a continuous cycle of motion, it's never really going to end. We don't know where it started, and I think that's probably a big problem, because if we think about universal consciousness, there's nothing saying that we didn't have control throughout the entire process, even before we were born. We might not have had any agency because we weren't aligned with the physical world. And if you allow yourself to be unaligned with the physical world, it would seem that you are acting on your own free will. So keep going. So now we'll go into some of the compatibilist replies. In response, have denied that freedom requires the ability to do otherwise. That causal determination precludes the ability to do otherwise. And that freedom or control requires sourcehood. Compatibilists have only rarely denied premise 2 of the source incompatibilist argument. I actually haven't gotten this far, so I'm learning as I read this part. But compatibilist denials of these premises have not been flat-footed. Instead, they are grounded in attractive conceptions of human agency. Oh, this will get interesting. So in what follows, we'll turn to the details of such theories, and in doing so, uncover just how distinct compatibilist theories answer the incompatibilist arguments set above. So classic compatibilism. Compatibilism place in compatibilisms place in contemporary philosophy has developed in at least 3 stages. The first stage involves the classical form of compatibilism, which was developed in modern era by empiricists Hobbes and Hume, and reinvigorated in the early part of the 20th century. The second stage involves 3 distinct contributions in the 1960s. So this has been going on for a long time. Contributions that challenge many of the dialectical presupposition driving classical compatibilism. The third stage involves various contemporary forms of compatibilism, forms that diverge from the classical variety and that emerged out of or resonate with at least one of 3 contributions found in the second transitional stage. This section is devoted to the first stage, that of classical compatibilism. So what is freedom? According to one strand with classical compatibilism, freedom is nothing more than an agent's ability to do what she wishes in the absence of impediments that would otherwise stand in her way. So this is what I'm saying. I can choose to set myself into a deterministic state of becoming really good at jiu-jitsu, right? And I chose to do that on my own free will. But it doesn't mean that it's going to happen. But I still have the free will to do what I wanted to do, the actions that would get me there. And this is all with a possibility or probability that is intangible. In my mind, it makes sense, but it's not a real tangible thing because you can't see that I'm ever going to win a jiu-jitsu tournament or that I'm ever going to be good at jiu-jitsu, right? And there will be obstacles that will look like it's deterministic. Within myself, there's still the will to try, the will to engage. So, where was it? The second involves 3 distinct. Where was it? How when he persists in his finding, no stop, and doing what he has the will, desire, and inclination to do. On this view, freedom involves 2 components, a positive and negative one. The positive component, doing what one's will, desires, or inclines to do, consists in nothing more than what is involved in the power of agency. The negative component, finding no stop, consists in acting unencumbered or unimpeded. Typically, the classical compatibilist benchmark, impeded and unencumbered action is compelled to action. Compelled or action arises when one is forced by some external source to act contrary to one's own will. So this is reactivity, basically, is what they're saying. And I do believe that instinctually there is reactivity, but the ability to not act on instincts shows that there is agency against determinism as well. So one thing I would say about this is, like in jiu-jitsu, there's a thing of dominating people. But when you are working with your partners, you have the will to not dominate your teammates. And I think that kind of shows a lot of this, is that, like, I've set into place that I'm going to dominate people in jiu-jitsu. But there is also a time when that I have the free will not to, because it is beneficial, and I can visualize the possibilities and probabilities of what will happen if I dominate my teammates, and then choose on my own free will a better way to create the outcome I want. And by doing that, my free will allows me to create determinism in the world. The same way that anybody can do. If you choose to do something and determining that will lead to a result. It is not the determinism that allows me to make the decision. My decision is not determined, because at the same time, I can choose against the outcomes that I am visualizing ahead of time. Now this view, freedom involves positive, negative, consistent. Okay, so for the classical compatibilist, I'm on the next paragraph. For the classical compatibilist, then, free will is an ability to do what one wants. It is therefore plausible to conclude that the truth of determinism does not entail that agents lack free will, since it does not entail the agents never do what they wish to do, nor that agents are necessarily encumbered in acting. Compatibilism is thus vindicated. But how convincing is the classical compatibilist account of free will? As it stands, it cries out for refinement. To cite, and I could agree with that, because you actually have to start getting into the technicalities of when is something, even though it seems deterministic, creating an intangible result that is not deterministic, that can actually be played with without making a decision. That's all you really need, is you need information that doesn't need to be acted on, and that can be manipulated internally in order to have free will. So that's why I brought up meditation or even dreaming. Like, in these processes, you have the ability to work with the internal world to change the way that things will happen through your own free will ahead of time. And always will set in determinism. Anytime you choose to do something, it's because you understand that there is a cause and effect to it. As it stands, it cries out for refinement. Yep. So we need to do more studying on and actually how Jordan Peterson explains it is like, we have action potential. He showed something like, when you choose to go like this, that happens ahead of time, even before I make the decision. But once I set this into motion, there's no stopping it. Like, once I say I'm moving my hand, there's no stopping it because I made that decision. And what the argument against this is that you can see action potential in brain scans ahead of time. But I think that action potential is weighing the variables within us and making sure it matches our internal state of aligning to ourselves. Because if I don't want to do that, I'm just not going to do it, right? I mean, it's not there. I can actually feel the action potential wanting me to do it, because in my head, I'm thinking about whether I'm going to do it or not, but I'm not going to do it. Right? In my hand, I can feel the neurons like wanting to push down like this right before. I choose not to. You can choose not to do something like that. And that's something you would have to really study yourself. I think because I've done so many sports, I can feel that within myself. You would really have to study yourself to see how that works out for you. But it's kind of like not wanting to press the red button, or like wanting to press the red button, but not wanting to at the same time. You have to come to that decision. And I'll tell you, every person wants to press the young button until they realize that they can weigh the options of doing that or not. I see my son wanting to do it every time he finds a red button. So it's the same concept. Like, the potential is there to do it. It's the choice of whether you choose to do it or not. Right now, the potential is there for me to drop my hand. I can choose to do it. I can bring it back. I feel the same potential in my arm that can do that. I choose not to do that. Right? So, and as I said, I personally think free will is even on a bigger, is larger than that. I think that free will can set determinism in for a long period of time. And that's like the wave function. Once your free will starts the wave function of, I'm going to do something. I'm going to get engaged with something. And through that, you begin collecting the data points, and then those close off. Then you end up seeing if the results were true or not. And then if those results weren't true. So in a sense, free will relies on the ability to become aware of determinism. It really does, in order to utilize free will, which is why I always encourage people to do a lot more, because the only reason I understand free will is because when I was doing a bunch, I started realizing that I had the will because I had so much sensory data points collected at one point. So for classical compatibilists, then free will is an ability to do what one wants. It is therefore plausible to conclude that the truth of determinism does not entail that agents lack free will, since it does not entail that agents never do what they wish to do, nor that agents are necessarily encumbered in acting. Compatibilism is thus vindicated. As it stands, it cries out for refinement. I'm going to skip down to 2.2. Consider the following incompatibilist objection to classical compatibilist account of free will. If determinism is true, and if at any given time an unimpeded agent is completely determined to have the wants that she does have, and if those wants causally determine her actions, then even though she does do what she wants to do, she cannot ever do otherwise. I got to reread that. If determinism is true, and if at any given time an unimpeded agent is completely determined to have the wants that she does have, and if those wants causally determine her actions, yes, then even though she does do what she wants to do, she cannot ever do otherwise. But that's why I make a point to say it's not at any given time. Free will is the ability to set a goal, and it's a small window. You have a small window for free will, because you start a new wave function. Once you make a decision, there's a new wave function that starts. And I do think that you can train yourself to have more access to free will, and make the decisions for yourself. But that when you get stuck in the matrix, I guess they call it, you get stuck in a loop, and your decisions and your actions will all be determined by what you've already previously done. This could be beneficial or negative, but it's what you have to do. It's what your free will pushes you to do. I'm probably going to finish off pretty soon because this is a lot, and I'm actually going to keep this article and go more into it. I just wanted to kind of get this conversation started. I'm going to finish up until 2.3. No, I'll finish 2.3. Yeah, I'm going to finish 2.3, and then we'll do section 3 later on. Classical compatibilists have responded by arguing determinism is compatible with the ability to do otherwise. To show this, they attempted to analyze an agent's ability to do otherwise in conditional terms. Since determinism is a thesis about what must happen in the future, given the actual past, determinism is consistent with the future being different, given a different past. So the classical compatibilist analyzed any assertion that an agent could have done otherwise as a conditional assertion, reporting what an agent would have done under certain counterfactual conditions. So if the facts change, people change. These conditions involve variations on what a freely willing agent wanted, chose, willed, or decided to do at the time of her freely willed action. Suppose that an agent freely willed X. According to the classical compatibilist condition analysis, to say that at any time of acting she could have done Y and not X is just to say that had she wanted, chosen, willed, or decided to do Y and X at the time, then she would have done Y and not done X. Her ability to have done otherwise at the time at which she acted consisted some such counterfactual truth. But given that a determined agent is determined at the time of action to have the wants that she does have, how is it helpful to state what she would have done had she had different wants than the wants that she did have? Assuming the truth of determinism, at the time at which she acted, she could have had no other wants than the wants that her causal history determined her to have. That was like a mouthful. Wow. The truth of the time at which she acted, she could have had no other wants than the wants that her causal history determined her to have. No, but that doesn't even make sense because you can have two wants. Like that's the idea of choice. It's actually why I always talk about shadow work. Like, your functions internally can clash. It's not always about like how you interact with people. It's also your internal world. That's what cognitive dissonance is, was when you have choice internally. And even though it's a subjective matter, people will tell you they have cognitive dissonance. It's like you can have all the facts and none of them lead to a clear choice. So you have to make the choice, and that's on your own free will. It's a class where I hold that the conditional analysis brings into relief a rich picture of freedom. Yes. In assessing an agent's action, the analysis accurately distinguishes those actions she would have performed if she wanted from those actions she could have not performed even if she wanted. This, the classical compatibilists held, effectively distinguishes those alternative courses of action that were within the scope of the agent's abilities at the time of action from those courses of action that were not. So, but you're talking about abilities. Now, we're talking more so about an internal state. That's what we need to look at. This just is the distinction between what an agent was free to do and what she was not free to do. This is not at all a superficial freedom. It demarcates what persons have within their control from what falls outside the purview. But this should change over time, like what a person has. Despite the classical of could have done otherwise failed decisively. Because it's intangible. The classical compatibilists wanted to show their incompatibilist interlocutors that when one asserted that a freely willing agent had alternatives available to her, that is, when it is asserted that she could have done otherwise, the assertion could be analyzed as a conditional statement, a statement that is perspiciously compatible with determinism. But as it turned out, the analysis was refuted when it was shown that the conditional statements sometimes yielded the improper result that a person was able to do otherwise, even though it was clear that at the time the person acted. She had no such alternative and therefore was not able to do otherwise in the pertinent sense. Well, we're going to need a time machine to really figure that one out, huh? So here's the example, and then I am going to... Daniel is psychologically incapable of wanting to touch a blonde-haired dog. Imagine that on her 16th birthday, unaware of the condition, her father brings her two puppies to choose between, one being a blonde-haired lab and the other a black-haired lab. He tells Danielle just to pick up whichever of the two she pleases and that he will return the other puppy to the pet store. Danielle, happily and unencumbered, does what she wants and picks up the black lab. When Danielle picked up the black lab, she was able to pick up the blonde. Was she able to pick up the blonde lab? It seems not. Picking up the blonde lab was an alternative that was not available to her. Let me just restart. Suppose that Danielle is psychologically incapable of wanting to touch a blonde-haired dog. What would make her psychologically incapable of wanting to touch a blonde? Like, this is so much speculation that it doesn't even make sense. But given her psychological condition, she cannot even... I'm back to where I was. Given her psychological condition, she cannot even form a want to touch a blonde lab. Hence, she could not pick one up. Why not? But notice that if she wanted to pick up the blonde lab, then she would have done so. No, because she can only pick up one. And it doesn't even make sense that she could have this... She can be incapable of wanting to pick up a blonde lab. Is that like a medical condition that I don't know about? That would be different. But as far as I know, it's not. There's no one incapable of that. They may not understand that a blonde lab exists, but if you put the blonde lab in front of them, then they're capable of realizing that that's a blonde lab and that they may want to pick that up. See, because you have determinism trying to make it true, it seems like that it's being inserted as it's deterministic, but there's nothing that says somebody couldn't touch or would ever have something saying they're incapable of wanting to touch a blonde-haired dog. The classical compatibilist analysis of could have done otherwise thus fails. According to the analysis, when Danielle picked up the black lab, she was able to pick up the blonde lab. Yeah. Even though, due to her psychological condition, which doesn't exist, she was not able to do so in the relevant respect. Hence, the analysis yields the wrong result. So even if an unencumbered agent does what she wants, if she is determined, at least as the incompatibilist maintains, she could not have done otherwise, since, as the objection goes, freedom of will requires freedom involving alternative possibilities. Classical compatibilist freedom falls. Now, the last thing, influence of conditional analysis. This will be the end of it. And then I got a lot more to read in another episode. Compatibilists failed to answer the classical incompatibilist argument. What they attempted to do by way of conditional analysis was deny the claim that if the determinism is true, no one can do otherwise. But given their failure, it was incumbent upon them to respond to the argument in some manner. It is only dialectically fair to acknowledge that determinism does pose a prima facie threat to free will, when free will is understood as requiring the ability to do otherwise. The classical incompatibilist argument is merely a codification of this natural thought. In light of the failure of the classical compatibilist conditional analysis, the burden of proof rests squarely on the compatibilist. How can the freedom to do otherwise be reconciled with determinism? As we'll see below, contemporary compatibilists attempt to speak to this issue. And that I'm actually going to do in tomorrow's episode, which you can join me for again at 9 o'clock. I'll do it tomorrow at 9 a.m., I believe. And we will go into parts 3, 4, and I think 5. No. And we'll get through all that. I hope that you enjoyed this. I did. It's a lot to think about, and I'm really enjoying getting into this concept because, like I said, I do think that typology is very deterministic, and that I think that it would be used better if it wasn't so deterministic, because I do think that when we think of cognitive functions, we're thinking about interactions between people, but internally these functions have a role as well. Your first and last function are always playing a role together. They do battle each other. They are what allow you to make a decision, weighing different factors and different inputs in order to create different outputs. So that's where I stand with this so far. I did end on the note saying that I'm wrong, so I hope to go into that tomorrow for you guys, and I hope you guys enjoy. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next episode.